punk had already died. After that Sex Pistols show, it basically was dying.
True. It was only alive for the 45-minute set duration.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of 1001 Album Complaints. It's the show where friends, musicians, complainers, and music fans tell the stories behind the albums from the list of the 1001 albums you must hear before you die. Now, for longtime listeners, welcome back. But if you're new to the show, we are going to do a deep dive into the making of an album, as well as the context surrounding its release, and then dive into some of the songs. And if you're like me, you are unfamiliar with today's album, don't worry. We're going to be dropping in clips along the way. Now, we've said it before, there are no sacred cows here on this podcast. So just a fair warning up front, we are going to poke some fun at today's band and album. I am sure of it. But that said, we're all music obsessives, and we know how hard it is to put the old pen to paper and pour your heart out. But that doesn't mean we can't also have some fun.
These guys seem like a bunch of fun-loving lads who would just really be okay with us making fun of their product.
They put the joy in Joy Division.
Yeah, I was going to say, we might start the call as friends, but I'm not sure we're going to end it that way.
Oh, yeah. All right. We'll see. Now, at the end of this whole thing, we're going to vote on whether or not you actually need to hear this album before you die, and then we'll randomly select next week's album. Now, I'm sure I'm nearly alone among our crew and our listeners in that I had never heard a note of Joy Division in my life. But I did come across a fun joke in my research this week. So here it goes. What's more depressing than Unknown Pleasures by Joy Division? Nothing. So if you're fascinated by sadness, misery, and heartache, then buckle up because we're slowing down to stare out the car window as we pass the wreck that was Joy Division. My name is Adam. I've been playing music for 30 years, played professionally for a decade, and like I mentioned today, we're talking about the debut studio album titled Unknown Pleasures by post-punk pioneers Joy Division. So let's drop in a clip of the opening track. I have to bring the energy early.
Right.
I thought you were going to say the album Closer, the second album. It's the next depressing one.
Yeah, right.
That's more depressing.
All right, now that we've got a little taste of what we've been listening to this week, let's throw it around the studio today for our crew introductions by way of a snarky tweet about the album. All right, we're going to throw it over to Rob first.
Thanks so much, Adam. Excited to get into it. And, you know, as is often the case in this weekly exercise of ours, I've listened to this so many times that I can't quite recall what my first impressions were. But I remember. This guy cannot sing.
All right. All right, next, I'm going to throw it over to our very special guest, who I will give a proper introduction to in just a moment. So, Andrew, the tweet floor is yours.
Encapsulating the sound of the industrial atmosphere of Manchester and the figurative and literal elbow grease that embodies the English city. This album sounds like it was tracked in a dank seaside cave amidst a winter storm, despite the fact that Manchester is not known for its caves and the closest maritime access point is over 50 clicks away. Nevertheless, the band's pensively musing songwriting coupled with famed lunatic Martin Hannett's deranged production yielded a masterpiece that influenced countless bands and musicians, present company included.
Damn. All right. It's going to be a feisty one, I can already tell. All right, Tom, let's throw it over to you, my friend.
Okay. If a hangover learned how to play an instrument and then had a jaded ex-punk ramble over their overproduced tracks, Unknown Pleasures would be the result. If this is what the cool kids are listening to, then I am not on board. I was, in fact, just bored.
Nice. All right.
It's going to be a rowdy one.
All right. And this is Adam. And my original tweet talked about war crimes a little bit, so I'm not going to give that one. But what I will say is Joy Division comes lumbering onto the scene, and with frontman Ian Curtis at the helm, who boasts a nearly 6-note vocal range, they release an iconic album celebrated for its use of groundbreaking production techniques, like reverb. All right, folks, like I mentioned, we have a special guest today. I'm very excited to introduce fellow dad rocker Andrew. Andrew's a multi-instrumentalist, a true music appreciator, and I know this because he routinely asks me if I've heard of bands that he's listening to. And undoubtedly, the answer is no. So I think he's going to feel right at home with the rest of the crew here. So Andrew, welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Adam. Very fun to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Awesome.
I hope you're ready to fight, Andrew, because I'm excited.
I am. I'm ready to spar with you, for sure.
All right, with the tweets out of the way, what we do next is usually throw it back around for some general impressions. Now, it sounds like you are all very familiar, so I'd love to hear how your week was revisiting this.
If you don't mind, Adam, I'd love to kick this off.
Sure.
Because despite my snark, I think this is great, and I'm ready to fight for it. And I know, of course I know, because I know you and Tom, I knew how you would feel about it. And I couldn't help. Every second of enjoyment I pulled out of it, I was thinking about the pain that you must be feeling because you're just not cool, and that's okay.
Oh God.
No, I'm going to pull that back just slightly. I had never actively put on a Joy Division album in my life until this week. But of course I knew who they were. I had heard some of their tracks. I'm sure this album has been played in my presence, etc. And so I would say it really grew on me. I think it's extremely vibey and interesting. I also agree with what I said in the tweet, which is the dude definitely can't sing, and I do wish he was better or did better takes. But that ultimately, it didn't stop me from enjoying it.
Interesting. All right. I truly didn't know where you were going to be coming in here, Rob, so that's good to know.
The funny thing, Rob, do you remember we played a show in Seattle, and there was a band that opened for us, and it was a guy with a guitar,
Yes,
and a guy who sang, and they had like a drum machine and a fog machine that they overused to a ridiculous degree.
Yes.
And it was the only band that Rob was like actively like, I refuse to tell them good set. I will not say it was a good set. And frankly, they had major Joy Division energy going on. Now, it's not Joy Division's fault that a bunch of people picked up what they did and did a much shittier version of it. But I have to say that some of the ramshackleness of that band came across a bit in this album. And some of these songs seemed underbaked. Especially they can't write endings. And even when they kind of have a crescendo, they don't even all hit the crescendo and stick it. And so that was part of my major problem with the album. Aside from Ian Curtis's singing, you're right, he can't sing. And there are just times where I'm not saying that he can't sing. He's not a good singer. His voice works sometimes, but there are other times where he's just hitting objectively wrong notes. And that's not an interesting choice. That's just a wrong note.
Right.
Well, I feel like I need to I do want to hear from Andrew and Adam, of course, but I want to at least respond to that anecdote because I think that you drawing this line between a crappy, first of all, the only thing I remember about that band is the fog machine, which says quite a lot. But some kind of carbon copy of a band that kind of sounds like how does that even have a connection to what we're talking about? And I agree, Ian Curtis's vocal takes are distractingly bad. Like there will be songs that I will be grooving to and I'll be like, oh man, you really should have done another take. I think you had it in you, man. And I also agree that in other words, this is one of those episodes where I think I'm going to have to agree with a lot of the complaints and I'll happily levy those complaints with you. Some of the ones you already mentioned. But the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Ultimately, it didn't matter. To me, I think it's got a vibe.
So I actually decided just for fun to play this record for my girls while driving in the car, my kids while driving in the car. So starts off and disorder kicks in and my younger one who's 11 says, oh, this is a punk record. And which I decided to correct her and explain that actually this is something called post-punk, to which she reacted by fake snoring. Right. And then
smart kid.
As you get into the record, and it's not necessarily, there's some slower downer tracks on it. And at one point she said, are these guys okay? To which I replied, sure. Well, actually, no. One of them has passed on and the other members are still play together. Well, some of them. The band that mom likes, New Order, and then cue more fake snoring. As I kept ranting on to the children. So
I'll respond to the immaturity comment from Tom too, because I do agree. It feels like an immature band. It feels like a really raw, unrehearsed, undeveloped songs. And I unironically was writing in my notes at one point this week, man, if they had just had a few more records and they'd pulled it together and maybe switched out that singer, they really could have gone somewhere. And then I was like, oh, wait, that did happen. It's called New Order, and they are better.
Or if they had lasted long enough to play to the point where people could get proper live recordings and live videos, because from what it sounds like, their live shows were like a high energy, like an interesting...
Pretty banging.
Right? Like an actual a piece of art, a piece of performance art.
That was my biggest complaint with the way that this is presented on this album. They felt at times tentative, and they felt at times like they were being held back. And I feel like they've even mentioned that they kind of felt a little hemmed in by some of the production and some of the environment in which they were recording. And I could have seen this being a good, energetic live show. I feel like everything was slowed down like 10% or something, and it just kind of dragged a little bit for me.
I could not disagree more. I mean, having not seen them live, of course, but I read that anecdote too about how Peter Hook said, oh, the producer was trying to cage us in and tamp us down, and we didn't have any of the punk energy of the live show, and instead it sounded like Pink Floyd. Oh no. And I'm like, that's what I liked about it. I don't need another punk band thrashing me with 16th notes. I don't need that.
No, I don't think that it's a punk band thrashing you with 16th notes. I think that it is a band in their element versus a band not in their element. And this recording didn't seem like it was a band in their element. And that's where the tentativeness, I think, came across a little bit. There are times where they do lock in. And on those songs, I actually really quite dig it. I think they got a fucking great rhythm section. And I particularly like the way that the bass is often the lead instrument.
The lead instrument, yeah, totally.
Oh, yeah.
Very bass forward.
He plays like 5x more notes than any other person sings or plays on the record.
Yeah, and I dig that.
Yeah, I liked it too.
A lot of the main melodies are coming from the bass player.
Who, by the way, is like untrained. And so
He was a guitar player.
we've talked about this before. He doesn't have stock to rely on. He has to come up with something for each song. He's not just like, well, I'm just going to go back to playing standard bass line 1. He has to write something new for each song. And I think that leads to some really interesting bass lines. I mean, it also leads to like some very obvious mistakes being left on the tape, but
Sure.
that is part of the charm to it. If you can say an album like this has charm, I think it's like anti-charm in its approach and delivery, but I find some of that charming.
Yeah, I overall, after reading the history and a lot of the reviews and the praise of this, I really do feel like the reason this is so prevalent in modern culture and is so impactful is because he killed himself. I hate to say that, but when I look at what people praise about this album, I just don't see it. You know, they're talking about Hannett was on the bleeding edge of production. I'm like, no, he did some reverb. He used sound effects. He had a synthesizer. It was 1979. If it was 1943, I'd be like, whoa, that's crazy. And even Robert Christgau, I disagreed with him. He said that Ian Curtis had emotion in his voice. I heard no emotion. The only thing he had was volume that he couldn't control. Like he would sometimes, like, I feel like if he was trying to emote, he would just go, and he'd like shout it. But that's not emotion. So I literally felt nothing from his vocals except for anger because they were so lousy. So that's where I'm coming in. But now, hang on. Just like a debate club, I have to defend this album because I am in fact leading the episode. So it's going to be an interesting one for me.
I just want to say that the thing, I know this is the hardest thing to get at, and I hope your story is going to flesh this concept out more. I'm sure it will, Adam. Of context. Everything is context. My impression, not knowing the full story, is that these guys did plant a certain kind of flag for a type of music that then became extremely prevalent to the point where we've now, as with the band we played with in Seattle that totally sucked, we've seen so many copies in the lineage of it that it doesn't even register as new anymore.
Sure.
But also, I think it's supposed to kind of embody, like I said, the spirit of that city. I mean, I have not been to Macclesfield or Salford or Manchester, any of these places, from what I understand. It's like cloudy indoors there. There's like smog inside your house. I mean, you kind of feel that in the recording and like the mood that these songs set. What did 1979 sound like in Manchester? Like that. Everywhere. I think that was kind of the overall vibe. Like every city has an energy and has that like low din. I think it kind of sounded like she's lost control.
Right.
You know, that's what it sounded like.
And to be fair, this was the beginning of Thatcher era England, which everything that I can understand is that was not only a total shit show, but the conservative reaction to that total shit show just made everything worse. And especially for young artistic people, they were really not quite on board. I mean, if only we had a parallel in our country for terrible leaders that we were not quite on board with.
We'll never know. We will never understand.
maybe one more thought about the bands this also reminded me of and why I could understand if we ended this politely disagreeing with each other, old friends, because I think we do agree on a lot of things. But this is more art project than band.
Totally, yes.
And I think through all these podcasts we've done, my observation about one of the dividing lines between, say, me, and I think Phil's probably on my side of the line, and Adam and Tom are somewhat on the other side, I'm overgeneralizing, is the amount of artsy pretentiousness that you can tolerate. I think I can just tolerate more of it than you guys, and I'm okay with that.
I can tolerate about as much, I think, as you can, Rob. And that's a lot more than Adam and Tom can tolerate.
Exactly.
I can tolerate artsy pretentiousness if it comes with precision, because that is one of the things I really value in music, is just getting good at your craft and being good at your instrument. And oftentimes I feel like when the focus is heavily on the artiness of it and not on the competence of its presentation, that often rubs me the wrong way.
That is definitely a fair comeback, but I think it is kind of baked into what I'm saying. I don't think you can be pretentious if you're really, really skilled. It just comes off differently.
I mean, as much as people would hate me to make this comparison, I mean, Steely Dan are pretentious as shit, and they are highly skilled. And a lot of those jazz guys, super fucking pretentious and also highly skilled.
I guess I'm agreeing with you, but I think that art is also something that is made with just sort of what's around. And so the parallels that I see are more to the Velvet Underground, right? It's an obvious touchstone here.
I don't hear it.
That you guys hated incorrectly, clearly. So here we are again, right?
Yeah, right. This is the rematch, Velvet Underground round 2.
Velvet Underground is an apt comparison because I don't think it's accurate to say that I hated Velvet Underground. I just don't get what all the hoopla is about. And I will kind of say the same thing for this band. Like, I don't hate this album at all. I will listen to many of these tracks again, but I don't quite understand why it became what it became. Because you can't deny what it became. I don't quite get why.
I can give you 3 reasons right off the bat. Amazing band name, amazing album name, and amazing album cover.
Yeah,
there you
that
have it.
album cover is pretty damn iconic.
All right, so we're going to throw it around the room to vote now with Rob's summary. All right, so this week I read a book called Decades, which is a biography of Joy Division and New Order. New Order, like we mentioned, being the band that would immediately spawn after Joy Division ended. I also watched a couple decent documentaries on YouTube, specifically a channel called Amplified that had a fan-made documentary that was really well done. But the story of Joy Division is full of grit, determination, and of course sadness and despair. But our story begins in Manchester in the 1950s. Joy Division is composed of 4 lads from Manchester. But before I get into a little bit of their backgrounds, I want to talk a bit about Manchester, like Andrew mentioned. We've heard in other episodes, Manchester, the city, is almost as much a part of the story of other bands as it is this band, and it really informed their worldview and their attitudes. While Manchester did escape most of the bombings from Germany in World War II, it never actually recovered from World War I. It was a factory town, and after the war, you were still considered wealthy if you had running water. There was an article written in 1950 of a guy who was describing Manchester and the buildings as only being held together by a coating of grime. And amongst its narrow streets was dirt everywhere and no water to fight it. Now, it really was a backwater back in the day, and that's where our story starts. All right, now, despite being the frontman and the center of the misery of this story, Ian Curtis was not the founder of the band. So instead, we're going to first talk about Bernard Sumner, who would eventually wind up playing guitar and keys on this album. Now, Bernard was born in January of 1956 in the town of Salford, which is an area just west of Manchester proper. Now, Bernard's is a sad story, too. You'll start to see a theme here. Bernard never knew his father. His mother, Laura, who was already dealing with the stigma of being an unwed mother, also had cerebral palsy and was wheelchair-bound. But that didn't stop her from flying into violent fits of rage stemming from undiagnosed depression.
I mean, the depression kind of makes sense.
Yeah, right.
I gotta say, it's pretty tough hand to be dealt.
Is the wheelchair held together by grime as well?
Yes. What kind of guy has like a one-night stand with a woman in a wheelchair and bounces on her to leave her to raise the child by herself? That is not a quality person.
Adam might need to explore that timeline a little bit more to see when the wheelchair actually comes into play, though, right? Is this a lifelong thing?
So his mother eventually does marry another guy named Jim Dickin, who is also disabled, and they all live with Laura's parents, who are blind. So From a young
You
age,
aren't making this up,
I
right?
am not. So from a young age, Bernard is basically a caretaker for 4 adults.
This is a Dickens novel already. Like,
Now, Bernard is not a particularly musical kid, but he did excel in school. In fact, he makes it into grammar school. And just as a reminder of the British education system, when you reach high school age, you either went to secondary modern school, which was aimed at more manual workforce jobs, or you went to grammar school, which was the gateway to better paying, cushier jobs. So on his first day at grammar school, he meets a kid named Peter Hook, aka Hooky, the eventual bass player in this band. Hooky was also born in Salford in February of 1956. Both of those guys make it through grammar school, though Hooky admitted that they were, quote, the scum at the back of the class. So right off the bat, I feel he had a little bit of a chip on his shoulder from where they came from. All right, so the two graduate, and this is when music starts to play a bigger role in their lives. Bernard said that he initially got into music because of Ennio Morricone's spaghetti western soundtracks, which is pretty cool.
Those are great, by the way.
Yeah, in fact, Rob, you were the one who turned me on to that. So yeah, good stuff. So the duo starts hanging out this place called Pips, where they were exposed to David Bowie and bands like Roxy Music. They're both working menial jobs at this point. Hooky worked in a kitchen. Bernard was a runner at random jobs in and around Salford. Standard stuff here. But then, on June 4th, 1976, something special happens. This specific event has been mentioned many times on this podcast because it seems that everyone who attended the show went off and started a successful band. That is the famous Sex Pistols show at the Lesser Free Trade Hall in Manchester that spawned a ton of bands, including the Smiths and the Fall and Joy Division. So both Peter Hook and Bernard Dicken were there. Bernard noted that it was inspiring because the Sex Pistols were, quote, just a bunch of working class twats like us. So the show, though, was not some masterpiece. Sex Pistols basically just played a bunch of covers. The Who, the Stooges, Small Faces, but it was their DIY aesthetic that stood out and inspired Hooky and Bernard. So the next morning, Hooky goes out and buys himself a bass guitar with some cash that he borrowed from his mom. Bernard bought a guitar, and their friend at the time, Terry Mason, bought a drum kit. All right, next up, brace yourself. They start practicing. Very unpunk. Not punk at all.
Post-punk, you actually practice.
Exactly. Punk had already died. After that Sex Pistol show, it basically was dying.
True. It was only alive for the 45-minute set duration.
It does seem that the more we explore punk, the window continues to close. It's 5 years. It's 3 years. It was 17 months. What?
And 45 minutes for a punk set is very, very generous, by the way. That seems very padded.
It is very.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking of all the time they had to receive the crowd's spit.
Sure. Taking breaks in between songs to tune their instruments.
So the Sex Pistols come back to Manchester again about a month and a half later. Bernard and Hooky are there again, but also in the crowd this time is a kid named Ian Curtis, but they don't all meet up yet. So Bernard decides that they need to keep this little proto-band progressing, so he puts an ad in the window of the Virgin record store in Manchester for a vocalist. Ian Curtis responds to the ad via a phone call, and he and Bernard talk a bunch, and Ian tells Bernard of his love for the Stooges and Velvet Underground, and Ian gets the job sight unseen. Or should I say, sound unheard.
Probably was a plus for Ian. I did see an anecdote that at that show that they went to where Ian Curtis was there, they didn't really talk to him, but they noticed him in the crowd because he had on a black leather jacket that just had the word hate written across it in like neon orange or something like that. And they were like, that's a cool jacket. I want to know that guy.
Well, this is tangential, but I always heard that story. It reminds me of the story of Malcolm McLaren discovering Johnny Rotten, the lead singer of the Sex Pistols. He just picked him off of the streets of London because he had a Pink Floyd t-shirt on, but he had scribbled, "I hate" over top of it. He was like, this is the guy to front my band.
That's all you need. So the initial iteration of this band gets together. They start rehearsing in a room above a pub in Salford. And even though Ian hates all other bands just on principle, he introduces himself to Pete Shelley, the founder of the Buzzcocks, who were a punk band from Manchester. And he's hoping to ingratiate himself with a known group, also get some advice, and just expose himself to the scene. So Ian cared. Again, very unpunk. He's trying to get his way into the scene and meet people. So good for you, Ian.
Well, didn't he also have like a wife and kid to support at this point in his life?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, not quite yet.
He does get married pretty young.
He had a lady friend who I think was like his high school sweetheart.
Right.
But they were not married or had kids yet.
So that's perfect. A little background on Ian Curtis. He was also born in 1956, but he grew up in a more bucolic area about 30 miles from Manchester. Ian was a notoriously shy kid, but also super smart and super into music, obsessed with music. So much so that he drops out of St. John's College, which is now Manchester College, to take a job at an elite record store in Manchester called Rare. But apparently he isn't music obsessed enough to actually keep that job for very long, which is actually a pretty punk move. So he's going back and forth, man. I don't know what he is. Is he punk? Is he post-punk? So he bounces around to various jobs, but winds up at a local job center in Macclesfield. That's the town where he grew up outside of Manchester, where he assisted disabled people, helped them find jobs. It sounded like he was kind of a social worker, kind of a mix of helping people get back on their feet. Now, here we go. Ian gets married at the tender age of 19 to a girl named Deborah, who was 18 at the time. All right, back to the band. It's March of 1977. The band is practicing and gigging, but also burning through a bunch of drummers, and they have yet to settle on a name. They were considering Stiff Kittens, which was a suggestion from the Buzzcocks.
It's kind of punk.
Yeah, it's pretty punk. But instead went with a reference to a David Bowie song, Warsaw, which is on Bowie's 1977 album Low. Now, they play their first gig as Warsaw in May of 1977. Now, the band is playing around a bit, but they're struggling to find the right fit when it comes to a drummer, and they do have a very...
Hold on. Before we get past this is one of the things in my research that absolutely blew my mind. They got national press coverage of that first show that they played as Warsaw. How the hell does that happen? How do you get the national press to write about your first show? It doesn't sound like they had connections or anything like that. I really want to know how that happened so I could try to replicate it, because it's never happened for me ever.
I don't have any details on that, but that's a great question.
Right place, right time?
I guess, but who's just going to like a 40-person show at a small club and being like, oh, you know what? I'm like the writer for the, I don't know, London Gazette or whatever the fuck. I'm just going to write, or NME or something. I'm just going to write an article about this band.
Well, maybe it was just that time where people were looking to jump on the bandwagon. They could tell something musical was happening.
All right, so they're playing around a bit, but they're struggling to find the right fit with the drummer, and they have a super unique way of firing drummers, which I think is pretty epic. One of their early drummers got drunk at a show, stumbled his way to the front of the stage, made an ass out of himself, and on the drive home, the band stops the van, asks him to get out and check if they had a flat, and then drove away.
Call that the Manchester exit.
Right.
These guys aren't post-punk. They are gangsters.
I mean, that's call for a murdering, you know? If you're just like out on some country road 30 miles from anywhere. Good Lord.
All right, now during all of this, they're still trying to find their identity as a band as well. Ian is trying to figure out what he wants to be as a frontman, and just as an example, trying to play around, he smashed a glass on stage one time and crawled across the shards like Iggy Pop and was just bleeding all over the place. Now that is showmanship.
That's one word for it.
Also pretty hard to replicate that every night.
Yeah.
If you're out there doing that.
It's WWF guys do it.
Socialized medicine, baby.
Right.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
Just alternate crawling your back and your front every other night. So Ian places an ad for a drummer, and Stephen Morris answers the call. Stephen, it turns out, attended the same school as Ian. So just a quick review here. The band is Bernard Sumner on guitar. He was 21. Peter Hooky Hook on bass at 21. Ian Curtis was 21. He was on vocals, and Stephen Morris on drums at 20 years old. So on December 14th of 1977, the band, who was Warsaw at this point, go into the studio to record 4 songs for an EP called An Ideal for Living. I want to go ahead and drop in a clip of a song from that EP. This is called Leaders of Men.
Some other's womb, just like any other room. Made a promise for a new life, made a victim out of your life. When your time's on the door and it gripped to the floor and you feel you can touch, all the noise is too much and the seas that are sown are no longer your own.
Super punk, almost unidentifiable as the band that produces tonight's album, I thought.
Is this the one where their manager was the one who was producing it and had the TV playing while they were playing, and it actually shows up on some of the tracks? I know they fired one of their managers because like it might have been their demos, but they were like handing out their demos to try to get shows, and the theme song for a TV show was like playing over part of it. And then at one point the guy's mom comes in and like asks him if he wants some tea, and it's all on the track.
That must have been one of these unreleased demos or something. Because I definitely didn't hear that in The Ideal for Living, but that's hilarious.
Listen, it's art. If you can define it, you're probably doing it wrong.
He's taking bold choices.
Well, I think also Leaders of Men sounds like what I think that more kind of focused, refined punk sound they were probably looking for instead of what ended up coming out of this album that we're talking about, you know, with the Hannett influence stuff. If they had gone in a different direction,
right,
different producer, who knows what would have happened.
Yeah, it's funny because when, Adam, you put that on the playlist and I listened to it, I was like, oh, this I can actually get down with. But then I was like, you know, we wouldn't be talking about this album if this was the product.
Exactly.
Of it, so.
Right,
Absolutely.
right.
Agreed, yeah.
All right, now the name Warsaw is pretty cool, but at the time there was another band, specifically a West London punk band called Warsaw Pact, who had already released an album just a month before Warsaw went into the studio for that EP. And the problem was that Warsaw Pact was on a major label, and major labels have lawyers. So their last gig as Warsaw is on New Year's Eve of 1977. And in January of 1978, they're looking for new band names. And so some quick trivia here for you guys. Which of the following was not considered in their search for a new name? Slaves of Venus, the Mancunian Masochists, Boys in Bondage.
I'm going to go Slaves of Venus.
I'm going to go the Mancunian Masochists.
Yeah, that's my guess. That just sounds too not.
That's correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was made up by me. But Slaves of Venus and Boys in Bondage were all potential band names after they got rid of Warsaw.
Does anyone else find it interesting they named themselves after a city? They must have been aware of Chicago, Boston, Kansas. I feel like there's a vibe with bands that take on city names, right?
They were rebelling against all of those 70s bands, right?
Yeah.
Subverting your expectations, Rob. Yeah,
I doubt they were Boston fans. That's what I'm trying to say.
Chicago had too many horns.
They were like huge Bowie fans and, you know, Iggy Pop fans.
Yeah.
I mean, Boston is not, it's not the polar opposite of those sounds.
I think it's pretty far away.
I'll say it's somewhere in the middle. It's a day's drive. I'll say that.
All right, now around this time, Ian is reading a book called House of Dolls by a former Auschwitz survivor named Yehiel Denur. And in that book, the author describes something called joy divisions. Again, everybody in the world knows this except me, but I'm going to say it anyway. All right, so these things called joy divisions, which were brothels set up by Nazis that forced Jewish women into sexual slavery. Essentially rape camps in the Warsaw ghettos. And like any sane person thinks, well, this is our new name. So they go with joy division. And
it's a good name. It
is a good sounding name. It's memorable and it's provocative, which I'm sure they liked.
Right. And in line with some of that Nazi stuff, a lot of people talk about the Nazi leanings, and I honestly don't think these guys were Nazis or even sympathetic to the cause. I think they were just young and stupid and trying to freak out the squares.
We had talked about this in the Susie Sue episode, where she used to like walk around with a swastika armband. I think it was just kind of in the youth culture rebelling at the time, and that's what's going to piss off your parents' generations because they literally just fought and died trying to kill the Nazis. And so they're like, what's the most offensive thing I can do? Oh, I'll wear a swastika, not thinking about the larger ramifications of that.
Again, pre-internet. This will never come back to haunt us.
A lot of punk is pretty short-sighted, let's be honest.
Yeah.
17-month view, that's it. So that EP that they recorded in 1977, An Ideal for Living, is released in June of 1978, almost 6 months after they started the recording process, and it was released under the name Joy Division. So they released it on a 7-inch vinyl record. And this was something odd that I saw in an interview, and that they put the EP on a 7-inch record, and that somehow that compressed the sound. So they hated the 7-inch pressing because it sounded like the entire band was underwater. So after they had sold a couple thousand of those, they had it reprinted on a 12-inch vinyl, but only 4 songs. And apparently that opened up the sound a lot more and you could hear things a bit better. But I didn't realize that compression was an issue in a vinyl world.
the closer the grooves are, the less information you're going to be able to get and the less movement you're going to get of the needle, right? So that's why there are limits to the amount of time you can put on any record. You can theoretically keep putting grooves in it up to a point, but you're going to get lower and lower quality, at least. I don't know if that's actually compression.
Okay.
Technically.
I got it. Yeah, because I would have assumed that 4 punk songs would have fit on 2 sides of a 7-inch vinyl. So I don't know what they were doing, or maybe the vinyl shop that they went to was just a startup. I don't know.
I think it's like 7 minutes-ish if you're playing it at 33.
Okay, all right. So maybe that was a little compressed there.
But honestly, 12-inch with 4 songs, you could have put a wheelbarrow in those grooves.
All right. So with their EP released and re-released on 12-inch, they are gigging, they're writing, rehearsing, and very shortly thereafter, they take on a manager named Rob Gretton. All right, so it's September of 1978, and remember, they've now changed their name, so Joy Division makes their debut television appearance on a show called So It Goes. They are introduced by a TV personality named Tony Wilson, and Tony Wilson is a television producer, journalist, and is just known on the scene for promoting Manchester bands, Manchester music. And I'm sure we could have an entire episode on this character, Tony Wilson, but he becomes a fan of Joy Division. And around that same time, he comes into an inheritance and uses that money to start his own label that he called Factory. So, the very first Factory record is a sampler that includes 2 tracks from Joy Division, but it only goes on to sell about 5,000 copies. Not terrible, but Joy Division is still trying to find a label who's going to take them on fully. Now, the band is floundering a bit. They really haven't established a large fan base. They're playing a lot of shitty gigs. And that struggle bus continues to plow on when, in late 1978, Ian Curtis has his first epileptic seizure. And if you're unfamiliar with epilepsy, it's a brain disorder that triggers seizures where muscles all over your body just start spasming uncontrollably. It's really scary, and even scarier to see happen to somebody. So his first seizure happens during a band fight in their touring van on the way home from a particularly shitty gig. So he starts seizing up in the van, and they drive immediately to a hospital where they just start medicating him like crazy. And again, this is where it kind of continues to get worse. He's instructed to stay on those medications, which were anticonvulsants. And no big surprise, there were a bunch of side effects associated with those medicines as well, not the least of which was unpredictable and violent mood swings. So these medications, though, they don't eliminate the seizures. So the seizures continue to occur more frequently, more violently, and he just starts spinning into a depressive state. No big surprise here.
Quick question, Adam. Did he try essential oils?
That's not punk at all.
Rub some crystals on himself and see if that solves the problem.
It's very unpunk.
Well, I think he was also instructed not to stay up late and not to drink. And when you're a gigging musician in 1979 in Manchester, like, what else do you do?
Yeah, so like overstimulation was one of the things that would cause them to come on. I don't know if you're going to get into it, but I was learning about his post-gig routine that he had with his wife, where because he had this fear of choking on his own tongue and dying in his sleep because of a seizure, he would go sit down with his wife and they would both stay up either until he had a seizure or until he was able to like tell that one was coming on by the change in the breathing pattern and then, kind of cut it off. And apparently they kept that up through the end of his life, basically.
Holy crap. So he was sleep deprived as well. So he would basically wait up all night until the seizure happened. And then once it happened, he knew that he could then go to sleep because it wasn't going to happen again. Oh my God. So that's a terrible way to start off 1979, but there are some positive things that are about to happen for the band.
Adam, you're like one of those newscasters who was like, and 14 children were killed, but a puppy in sunglasses is...
Let's go to a clip.
Right. What's happening on the big board behind us? We see that.
That squirrel is water skiing.
So Ian lands on the cover of NME, which is the New Music Express magazine in England, in January of 1979. Now, this despite the fact that all the band members still have day jobs. But Tony Wilson comes back into the picture, and under the Factory label, he offers Joy Division a pretty sweet deal. Factory would front the cost of the album, and after they recoup the costs, they would split earnings 50-50 with the band, and the band would retain artistic control of the project. However, I think it's debatable that the band has artistic control because enter their producer, Martin Hannett. Hannett is in the music business and at the time is working with a recording studio called Strawberry Studios, which is also where today's album is recorded. And that is a perfect spot for our favorite segment, By the Numbers. I have an extended set here, so buckle up, boys. All right, 8,000, as in 8,000 pounds. That's the budget that Factory Records gave the band in 1979 to record this album, which would be about 40,000 US dollars today. All right, next number, 50 pence. That's what it would take to get you into that legendary Sex Pistols show in June of 1976, which would run you about $350.
I don't know. How much did you have to spend on your outfit, though, to get let
that's
in?
a good point. Yeah, that's a lot. 150. That's the capacity of the Lesser Free Trade Hall where the Sex Pistols held that influential show. But at that show, there were probably only about 40 people there.
But 7,000 have claimed to be there. Is that your next number?
Right? Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Next number is 400. 400 pounds. That's about how much the band spent out of their own pockets to have that first EP, those 4 songs recorded in Ideal for Living. 19. CP1919. That's the official name of the radio pulsar star, according to the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Astronomy, whose radio signal visualization was put on the album cover. And in relation to that, 1049. That's the opening bid for an actual authentic vintage 1980 Joy Division t-shirt featuring the cover art from Unknown Pleasures on eBay. It's crazy.
I was waiting for you to say like 5% the amount of people who are wearing that t-shirt on the street that have ever heard this album.
Totally.
So the craziest thing is that the band never officially made t-shirts until like the 2000s. They missed out on all that sweet t-shirt money because they thought it was like selling out to make t-shirts. Like, what the fuck?
I dare say this is a prototypical punk show type t-shirt. It's abstract. It's black. Yeah, it's monochrome. I mean, it's great. Yeah.
Doesn't have the band or album name on it.
Exactly. Yeah. Why would you want that? Yeah.
So I don't know if this came up in your research, but it might be one of the numbers you want to throw out there, which is 48 hours, which is when I believe it was 2005, Disney put up a version of the Joy Division shirt where Mickey's head was in the logo of the waves. And it lasted for 48 hours before a general outcry from the public forced them to take it down. Because apparently they didn't seek permission to do it or anything like that. They just had it up for sale on their site.
That's how you know your design has made it quite far.
Yeah.
And can you think of anything less punk than putting Mickey Mouse into the waves of that logo?
For Disney adults, too. This is not for kids. This is for adults who are like all about Disney.
Oh, my God.
Not punk.
All right, next number is 16. That is the number of songs recorded for this album, and only the 10 best, in air quotes, made the cut. Now, 15,000. That is the number of albums sold of Unknown Pleasures in the first 6 months after its release. Failed to chart. That is until Ian's death, at which point it made it up to 71 in the British charts.
I mean, that's already kind of a lot for how weird this band is, right?
Yeah, 15,000 in 6 months ain't terrible. I'd be happy with that number. All right, next number, 0. The number of singles released for this album. Can you imagine that this band wasn't really into releasing singles?
Not really radio conscious. Not a lot of radio edits of these songs that they were releasing.
Right. All right, 1. So a couple days after their TV debut, they played a show in Huddersfield, a town in West Yorkshire, at a place called Kirkwood Rooms, where the audience consisted of 1 person. Yes, they played a show to 1 person after being on TV. Yeah, that's rough.
Well, I've done that and I've been on TV. So
I was going to say, we've all done it. Where's the shame there? Where's the shame?
Some of the better shows that we have played in terms of performance have been in front of nobody.
Right. Yeah. All right, 13. Here's a dark one for the episode. What does that even mean at this point? 13 is the number of women that the Yorkshire Ripper killed. Now, there was a serial killer on the loose in England, and there was a suspicious pattern of the murders and that they coincided with the towns where Joy Division was playing. Hookie and Stephen Morris were even questioned by police. Now, the real story is that Joy Division could only get gigs at the shittiest clubs in the worst part of town that they visited, including the red light districts.
Yeah. And all the women saw their shows and then killed themselves.
Right.
I thought you were going to dateline us. Just the...
And so with all these gigs in the red light districts, it just so happened that they were near where the Yorkshire Ripper was killing prostitutes. So add that onto the happy train here. And with that note, we want to thank each and every one of you. We're so appreciative to be able to spend an hour a week with all of you chatting about these 1001 albums. And if you're looking for your own unknown pleasure, I want to invite you to join our mailing list. It only takes a couple seconds, and it's a great and free way to help support the show. We'll keep you up to date with the occasional email about upcoming episodes, listener polls, show ideas. We promise, no spam. So just head over to the episode notes and click the Join Our Mailing List link.
I love the shoehorning in of you want your own unknown pleasure. Wait, do you have a disorder where you love getting spam emails?
Are you the saddest person you know? All right, so when we last left the band, they were heading into Strawberry Studios, a studio that had been recently used by Paul McCartney to record his 1978 album London Town, which sounds a ton like this.
I was going to say, Strawberry Studios sounds so twee and lovely.
Really?
So Joy Division records the album over the course of 3 weekends. One to record the music, one to record vocals, and one to mix.
What about the one to wear black turtlenecks and smoke cigarettes?
Now, all told, it's 18 months from the time they release their EP, An Ideal for Living, to the time that they release this album, which has been described as neo-goth rock. Now, the band doesn't like the album. In fact, they kind of hate it. They don't think it represents them or what they actually sound like. Martin Hannett has his hands all over this album with strange sound effects, odd production techniques, and Hannett does not have a ton of confidence in anyone but Ian, as he called the band, quote, one genius and 3 Manchester United fans.
So, before he got to it, it sounded like an ABBA record.
Right.
I guess he had a lot of, Hannett seemed to have a lot of disdain, maybe for the whole band, maybe just Hook, because Hook seems like kind of a heel, but I guess Hook said like the band's on the left and Hannett's on the right. And if they said anything like, hey, the guitars are a little quiet, he'd scream like, oh my God, why don't you just F off? And they then like shout things like, do it again, but more cocktail party, more yellow, like all these like weird, like do it faster, but slower. Like, wait, hold on. Just sounds insane.
Oh, sounds like he's pulling from the Brian Eno oblique strategies deck.
Seriously. Now, Adam, maybe you can shed some light on this. I saw in a documentary that he demanded that the drums were all recorded with absolute separation, and it kind of sounded like he demanded that they were sort of like recorded separately.
Yeah, they
from
were.
Even each other.
Yep.
So was the drummer literally just like, I'm just doing the kick drum take now, and I'm just doing the tom take now?
Oh. That explains why it sounds like a crappy drum machine, even though it's a real guy. I'm serious.
Yeah.
And Stephen Morris is known for his actual like metronomic timing. Like he actually is a really, really good, drummer in the pocket drummer like that. But that was not showcased on this album.
Yeah, it doesn't sound off time. It just sounds a little devoid of life. But I thought that was more of an aesthetic choice. But if you're recording each drum individually, that's kind of what you're going to get.
So he wanted absolute separation so that he could affect them as he wanted. And when I read that as well, it reminded me of our Lenny Kravitz episode, Let Love Rule, because for that episode, I watched a documentary with a studio engineer named Richard Kaplan from 2014. And he had done work in the Motown studios in the late 60s and early 70s. And he said that was standard fare. So the drummer would literally sit down, hold sticks and air drum while just hitting the kick drum with his foot. And they would record the entire song. He'd put on headphones, he'd come back, remove everything but air play along, and then do the hi-hats, and then come back and do the snare. So that's why a lot of the Motown drumming has this like super clean sound, because they didn't want that bleed.
Interesting. I will say that a lot of the time on this album, they do not have live band energy at all. And I think that probably accounts for that. But there are times where I feel like they achieve live band energy. And if they are achieving live band energy under those constraints, that is an achievement. Absolutely. Because that's about as artificial as you can possibly get.
Right. So Hannett mixes the album at night because he doesn't want any input from the band. He even goes so far as to add keyboards to some of the songs without telling the band.
Hold on. You're telling me this was recorded during the daylight?
Well, it was mixed on one weekend. So maybe he wanted to do his stuff when they weren't there.
Ian Curtis is knocking on the studio door at 7 a.m.
With his cup of coffee. Let's go.
You got to understand, Rob. It's like in a casino, there's like a layer of grime on the windows, so you can't actually tell if it's daylight outside.
You don't know what day it is or if it even is day at that point.
Good point, yeah.
So Hookie, the bass player, said, "We hated it. Me and Bernard wanted it to be so much more rocky. I felt Martin had robbed us of our power. It was drained and weedy." And I know I joked a little bit about the production in my tweet, but here's some fun little production notes because I know that this album people rave about it for its production. It did use one of the first digital delays on the market, an AMS DMX 1580S. And so he would put the drums through there to get some of the weird delayed stuff, and he was able again to isolate so he could do it on just a single piece of the drum or just a single instrument.
You could argue that this is setting the tone for the 80s, which I know none of us particularly love that sound, but I think a lot of these were kind of forefront techniques for what was about to come for this decade of new wave and synth wave and all this other stuff, goth music.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I, in my notes, in my general impression, said it sounds way more 80s than it does 70s. And that is certainly an achievement coming out in 1979 and being ahead of its time and certainly influencing a lot of stuff downstream. You know, I wanted to put in the counterpoint to Adam, your comment about how people have praised this production. I know a lot of people in like the punk community hated the production as well and thought that it was way overproduced. And the Dead Kennedy song, Nazi Punks, Fuck Off, like literally the spoken intro is Fuck Off, overproduced by Martin Hannett, take 4. And then they like kick in.
Dude, that's crazy. Wow. Nice pull. All right. Tom gets the obscure pull reference for the night. Well done.
I read a little bit about the AMS DMX 1580. Martin Hannett actually may have had a hand in the creation of that. I guess he knew a couple of former aerospace engineers, Mark Crabtree and Stuart Nivison, to name drop. And he would meet them in, 76 and 77. They'd meet in like an obscure parking lot somewhere. And he would describe sounds he heard in his head. And then they would go and try to create a unit that would actually mimic that. And that's like what the vocals on She Lost Control are going through that. Much of the drums are going through it.
I assumed that the vocals on She Lost Control were through the can with a string.
Yeah, exactly. From a pub across the street or something like that.
Yeah.
And like those whooshing sounds that happen on Disorder.
Those are cool.
That is all. But again, stuff that like, the band came back and they're like, I don't think we actually made any of this. And
Did we do any of that?
Oh, interesting.
it's funny you said about the effects and like the revolutionary recording, tactics. It's like, do you mean reverb? Because apparently there were 2 EMT 140 plate reverbs. This was good. The Marshall time modulator, which Peter Hook referred to as the Marshall time waster, an Eventide H910, another AMS DM220 tape phase simulator, and a Mellows tape echo. So reverb, tape echo.
Can you imagine coming in the day after he finished mixing and you remember what you played and you sit down and there's like space lasers and keyboards and weird sound effects? Like, I would love to have been a fly on that wall and to look at their faces.
And you're like a punk band who doesn't even have a tuner. And you come in with this like instrument and chord. And he's got this like NASA setup. And he's like, oh boy, this is going to be great.
This was developed by rocket scientists. How punk is that?
It turns out, it seems like I'm learning that what I really like is this producer's work. So clearly I am not punk.
All right, so this album is officially released on June 15th of 1979. In order to round out our story, I'll just give a little info on how things came crashing down around Ian and the band. Ian is sinking deeper and deeper into depression. He has an affair with a woman who still claims that it was all platonic. In March of 1980, they start recording their second album, but Ian's seizures are getting worse and more frequent. At one point while recording the second album, Ian had disappeared for a while, and Hooky found him unconscious in the bathroom after he had a fit and had smashed his head on a sink. The band does get an opportunity to head to the US for a tour, including an opening slot for a band called the Stranglers. Now, there was a lot of trepidation from Ian about heading to the US, so much so that he actually attempted suicide once by overdosing on phenobarbital, which is one of his seizure medications. Now, he fails to kill himself, but he does leave a note declaring his love for his mistress.
Ooh.
Yeah, rough.
That's gotta sting.
Yeah. During one of their live shows that was leading up to the US tour, one of the lighting technicians turned on a strobe light, and that sent Ian into a fit, and he winds up crashing into the drum kit. And they carry him off stage and they end the show early. Around the same time, Debbie, Ian's wife, starts divorce proceedings.
Probably because of that love note to the mistress. That's gotta be tough.
It was weird near the end where Debbie absolutely knew what was going on with the mistress, and they would actually like see each other and talk to each other at gigs. It seemed very odd. They kind of called the mistress the muse, like she would go on these small local tours with them while Debbie, the wife, who was a nurse, stayed at home. It was really messy.
This is a semi-serious question, but I've always seen those warnings for epileptics, that there's going to be flashing lights on TV shows. But can people who have this problem like go to any live concert event? Because I feel like a lot of it is that.
Great question. I don't know if you could get some kind of glasses that filter out something. You're right. That would be, man.
It's a really common thing to happen at a show.
Or if you can take some sort of pre-medication that'll protect you or something. I don't know.
With their first gig lined up in America, which is supposed to be on May 23rd of 1980, Ian's life is quite literally falling apart. And on May 18th, 1980, just a couple days before they're supposed to leave for their USA tour, Ian goes to the house that he and his wife still share. Despite the pending divorce, his wife Debbie is at work. Ian drinks some whiskey, some coffee, and watches a movie called Stroschek by Werner Herzog, which is about a German street musician who was released from prison, moves to rural Wisconsin to escape his life's problems, but of course, his problems don't go away. And while the character doesn't explicitly kill himself in the movie, it's heavily suggestive of that. So Ian watches this movie. He then listens to Iggy Pop's The Idiot, and then sometime that night, he hangs himself in the kitchen at just 23 years old.
Dude, that's all super messed up and super sad. And not to get down and kick a guy when he's down, but also super inconsiderate to do it in the home of your wife that you're divorcing and make her come home to find that. That's got to be one of the most traumatizing things that could possibly happen to an individual. And I mean, I'm not going to speculate as to the man's motivations for that, but I'm sure she probably walked in and was just like, what the fuck? Like on many levels, what the fuck, you know?
Yeah.
It does speak to the importance, though, in terms of the band. And we kind of touched on earlier about how, 2 records, which weren't by some people's standards super impressive. But the fact that Ian Curtis is sort of this icon of both mental illness and other neurological disorders like epilepsy, where they did not have the treatments at the time. And, Tom, I totally agree. Completely inconsiderate. I mean, I don't know if the kid was not at home, but obviously you are a child who grows up knowing that this is the path your parent took.
And the kid could have come home. You don't know that kind of stuff,
So, but in some ways, that's kind of why I think the band also is so important to stand as to kind of bring that awareness again for mental illness.
Yeah, clearly he was not in a great place and not thinking clearly about it. It wasn't a calculated thing or anything like that.
Although I did read that either Bernard or Hook said, really look back at his lyrics. He was really, really sad. I'm like, you have to look back at that? You didn't notice that? In real time, it's right out there. It's all on the table.
Right.
How the kind of despair he was going through, I think, especially once epilepsy kicked in.
Yeah, there's not a lot of veiledness to these lyrics in terms of the fact that he is unhappy and depressed.
And speaking of depressing, what do you say we get into some songs from our focus list? I don't have transitions tonight. My God. What do you want me to do? Jesus. All right. We got to get to these songs, people. All right. So first up on our focus list is the open.
Pretty good energy. And I definitely, as an opening track, think that this doesn't necessarily set the tone for the rest of the album, but it hooked me in to say, okay, yeah, let's listen to what they got.
Which part hooked you in, Tom?
It's the bass line, of course.
Zinger.
It's great, yeah. Now, there's a lot of errant string noise going on here in the bass part.
You don't say.
Yeah. And some straight up just wrong notes, but it honestly doesn't bother me. And I really kind of actually think that this is a relatively good vehicle for Ian Curtis's voice as well, compared to some of the other songs, definitely.
I just feel basic saying this is my favorite track, but I do like the track a lot. And then I watched the documentary about Joy Division on YouTube, and the documentarian was like, this first track is cool, but it's also kind of bullshit in terms of what they were really about. Damn. Way to make me... I was thinking I was cool for a second.
This also gets to part of my sort of overall annoyance with the Joy Division fandom, is that they have to be extra cool. It almost seems like they're like, you can't like the songs that are actually good. You have to like the tough songs. That's how you really know you're a fan.
But I think the song is great. Driving rhythm section, like you said, especially the bass. And I love this droney, understated guitar approach, even though I am a guitar player and we like to play too many notes oftentimes. I also love to hear when people are really restrained. We already mentioned the synthy swooshes. That's just a cool part of the creepy haunted house energy that you're getting here. I think it's a great opener.
I agree. I feel like it's the soundtrack to your like post-punk starter kit, if that's the route you're going to go with your music. I mean, some of the stuff that Hannah does on this one with those like soundscapes actually sound very intentional, as much as the band may not have been involved in them. I started as a guitar player when I was in 6th grade, and at some point I was in a band with 3 guitar players, and we drew straws and I had to play bass. So any song that features lead bass, but the lead bass though, like it's in that mid range and it goes in tandem with the guitar, and some of those flubbed notes kind of create some dissonance. And I'm sure the band was like, Martin, can we fix that? He's like, why don't you F off? More Cocktail Party. Faster but slower.
How about Jazz Division, baby?
Yeah. And listen, as a teenager and adult, I've, either ridden a bike or a skateboard with, I had this on tape when I was younger with some sort of, device, listening to it while cruising around. It has that sort of energy to it as well. It's a banger.
I don't think it's depressing at all. It gives me energy, for sure.
I don't think it's a mission statement, though, but I like that they open the album with it. Tom, to your point, it got me. Like, I was like, oh, what? Again, had never heard this, and I put it on, and it was a little rattly, a little messy, but I dug it. And you're right, it was very open. The bass and the guitar and the drums, everything sounded great. And the bass player's working overtime on this one, and he does something so cool, which is, I worked this out on the piano earlier. The chord pattern is essentially the B flat to a G minor to an E flat. And again, we're talking everything single notes. The bass is playing a single note and the guitar is playing a single note. You're not even getting chords. The bass player manages to imply a diminished chord with one of the notes that he hits. He basically implies that he's playing like an E diminished 7th. It's crazy. Wow. I went over to the it's wild.
It's like Phil's here.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, seriously.
For the lay people in the audience, that's the part that sounds wrong.
Right. Now, I did think that the song kind of limps to the finish. Tom, you had mentioned like they don't really have endings, and at the 2:58 mark, it feels like no one knows what's happening in the band. It sounds like a mess.
I'm sorry that there's no video for the listeners out there, because Adam just became like a wacky wavy arms guy outside of a car dealership. Right. It was gorgeous. It was outstanding.
I agree with you, Adam, that one of my criticisms that's going to come up on several of these songs is that I feel like you get the sense that they're like looking at each other like, should we just end the song now? Like, it's not like they're like, okay, we're coming up to the, the 64th measure here. We're going to, okay. Now they're just like, so is this song over? I don't know. Oh, okay. It's over here. Yeah.
And they had been gigging for so long. And I know like they had a weekend for instruments, a weekend for vocals, a weekend for mixing, but you would think that these were a bit more fleshed out. And for $40,000,
that's one of the guys in the band's job, oftentimes the singer, since he's not presumably playing an instrument during the take, right? To just go, because if you have these songs that just have repeating sections over and over and over again, Tom was joking about counting 64 measures. Like, only classical musicians do stuff like that, but rock musicians almost never do. And instead, someone just goes, one more time, or, ending here into the mic, and you cut that part later.
Right.
And a lot of times in especially feel-based takes, you sort of feel the crescendo and you're like, all right, that was it. Mm-hmm. Now we're going to wrap it up here. And I feel like they often build to crescendos, but because they don't sort of stick the landing, it takes away a little bit from that build that they've done, where it just sort of is like, oh, and one guy doesn't even stop playing when everybody else stops playing. And you're like, okay, if you had nailed it, that would have been pretty spot on. You would have earned that crescendo.
The 40 grand, a lot of that probably went to Hannett's drug habit. I don't know how cheap smack was back then, but there was a lot of the budget was,
That's a very good point.
fueling Hannett's madness.
I'm going out to buy some gear. And
That's what they call
with him,
it.
You probably don't know.
Right.
Is it a new plate reverb or is it heroin? You don't know.
It was clearly both. We know that based on the record.
Yeah, right. All right, we're going to move on to the next song on our focus list. This one is called Insight.
The sense of style and the taste of making sure you were right. Hey, don't you know you were right? I'm not afraid anymore. I keep my eyes on the door, but I remember.
Here's where we start to get into Joy Division karaoke. I kept thinking this was Homer Simpson sings Joy Division.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah, that's pretty
Every
accurate.
time I heard this, I was thinking about Adam rending his clothes.
Just waiting for that, message to the group chat of guys, I quit.
I'm done.
Not doing this
is
anymore.
it. Well, this was one of the more egregious vocal things where I mentioned earlier, I don't get any emotion from his voice. And when he does, every time he says remember, he shouts the middle syllable. And you would think that with all the money, maybe they could have ridden the mixdown track a little bit better. Just
I
a
think his
thought.
vibe is monotonous. So I agree he's not an overly emotive singer, but that's my problem with it is not that. And by the way, I like what the band is doing. I think this is a good groove, but he is kind of shitting all over it because those are some pretty distractingly bad notes. I ultimately did probably enjoy the song. It's not my low point. I dislike it more when the band does not have a driving force behind it, but I get why it's in the way of me liking it more.
I had a big problem with the guitar in this song. Specifically that the bass is playing really high and the guitar is also operating in that same sonic space. And it works. There's other songs where the bass is playing up high and the guitar starts playing low, and it just provides that nice contrast. And I think that's probably part of the reason why they mixed the guitar like super low and in the left channel, because it was just clashing with what was going on with the bass. And so it felt like there was like an element missing to the song because they were trying to minimize one of the elements so that it didn't step on top of what was clearly the sort of driving element of the song, which was the bass.
I actually thought it was a great groove. I got no problem with what the band's doing.
I got no problem with what the bass and drums are doing, but I feel like the guitar could have put some bottom end in there.
And there's use of like weird kind of excess mishigas that I think Hannett became famous for in the background. There's an antique elevator, is that like weird sound in the beginning of the song. And
Yeah.
of course, my kid asked, like, does this song have lasers in it? I'm like, I guess so. That's kind of the direction they went in. Like, pew, pew,
My
pew,
son
pew.
was like, this sounds like Star Wars music. And I was like, oh.
But it
okay,
also,
yeah, I get it.
with having that long intro with like weird sounds, like that kind of sets the stage for stuff that like The Cure and the Banshees did, where you have that extended intro, like again, to sort of create tension. But then it is a little disappointing the way his vocal treatment of this one. I agree.
I do like some of their openings, including this one, because it feels like it starts up on a beat you're not 100% expecting. So even though it's a little indulgent, that long sound effect laden opening, at least it kind of catches me off guard when it drops in. And I feel like they use that trick a couple times.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say this on this track. I'm probably not going to repeat it later. I'll be thinking it, but just know that I won't repeat it later, is that these lyrics are bad teenage poetry. And I don't particularly like them all that much. And maybe if I had listened to them when I was a teenager, it would have hit me better. But as an adult, I'm just kind of like, Yeah, man, like most of adult life is a boring letdown. It kind of sucks. You just fucking get over it and go to work and find joy in small things. But yes, being a kid was better. I get it. But, kind of get over it and move on.
I would agree. That's another place that I can't really understand the hype. I did note a few sets of lyrics that I did enjoy. I thought some of the lyrics in Disorder, for instance, were good. And there's one other song where I really liked the lyrics. But in general, I thought they were fairly immature and not that interesting. And I felt like the rabble online was constantly talking about his lyrical prose and poetry. I didn't really see it.
Cue the hate mail, and we're probably going to have to get our like.
You were starting to get a fan base in the UK, and you just blew it. You blew it. Don't mess with Ian Curtis.
By all means, defend this song, or what's the other one? She's Lost Control. Defend those lyrics, please.
Right.
Oh, shit. I actually think I might defend the lyrics to She Lost Control, oddly enough.
Well, that's our next song, but I do want to throw in a quick note here from a gear standpoint. The synthesizer used on this was actually a kit-built synthesizer. So you would mail away for this synth, you'd get it, and you'd assemble it yourself, and that's what they used for this song, for those laser sound effects. All right, let's move things on to the song we just mentioned. This is She's Lost Control.
It says it all, she's lost control, and she's clinging to the nearest passerby. She's lost control, and she gave away the secrets of her past and said, I've lost control again. And of a voice that told her when and where to act, she said, I've lost control again.
I listed this as my low light. It never establishes a groove of any kind. The bass is playing too damn high. Sorry, Tom. And I don't like the lyrics either. And I think the drums particularly sound like a tinny drum machine on this one. Also, it goes on too long. Can I add any more?
Here on all of those.
I saw something that said that this is Joy Division's most important track, and it is basically the high water mark and the focus of the album. And I was like, you are out of your goddamn mind. And then they kind of explained it, and I was like, well, I can sort of see where you're coming from. This song lyrically is supposedly about an interaction that Ian Curtis had when he was doing social service, where a woman came in who was an epileptic and had a seizure in front of him before he was diagnosed with epilepsy.
Right.
And it really impacted him. And then he found out later that she had died in her sleep, choking on her tongue. And that's what led to his obsessive after show routine, where he was so worried about dying in his sleep because of that. And that's like what the lyrics to this song are about. And after I saw that, I was like, okay, I understand more where you're coming from in this. And this isn't just some story about a girl or something like that. So I also don't like the song, but I will say that I can understand where they're coming from.
But I love what it stands for.
Yeah.
It's like Sting. You don't like his music, but he's out there making it.
Who says I don't like Sting's music? Come on. I love, 14th century ballads done on a lute.
The lute. Listen, the song's 2 words. It has lead bass. So I'm in at least, I'm going to at least stick around for the party. I kind of wonder if it had had like double timed drums, if it might be a little bit more interesting and would have been more of like a driving banger kind of song. I did watch Anton Corbin's biopic about this called Control. Came out in 2007. I think it's funny because they actually have, some other musicians kind of recreating the songs and a different singer, kind of like when the Doors movie came out and Val Kilmer sang this stuff. And when you listen to it, like, oh, this is actually a bit more refined, like polished Joy Division. These songs are actually pretty, this pretty good. It sounds like it's like a different sort of thing. But in the movie, when they do this, that like that persists throughout the song, it's like an aerosol can they're just spraying at a microphone. Like that's all it is. It's not DMX ASM 140 or whatever. It's just a spray can.
So one of the things that I find hard to say that this is essential is that the band themselves re-recorded this song like a year later. They did another version of this within a year of the release. And if you don't have the confidence in the song to even give it a calendar year before you gotta give it another go, how am I supposed to say that this is absolute essential listening?
This song reminded me when Phil, who's another co-host on the show, known him since I was in second grade, but Tom, you might have been there as well. When we were in like seventh grade, we started writing songs, like really bad songs.
Yeah.
That sounded like this. And we had a song called The Arsonist Next to My Brother, which was just like a droning bass line that would do the same thing. And Phil was going, the arsonist next to my brother, and would just say something stupid. That's what this song is.
I think that one's on the most recent Decemberist album.
Anyway, I heard this and I was like, wow, this feels like 8th grade songwriting, musically and lyrically. But again, I get what you're saying with the backstory of how terrible that was for him to then become obsessed with swallowing his own tongue, and that's nuts. So
I think you should lay down those tracks this weekend, Adam. I mean, you make $1 million from, what's out there now.
We need 3 weekends, please. Thank you.
Done. 3 weekends. 2 to record, 2 to mix, 2 to wallow in despair. You're done. In and out.
I will be wallowing in despair on my own time. Thank you very much.
All right, let's move on to the next song. This one is called Shadow Play.
Center of the city where a road's been waiting for you. To the depths of the ocean where a hope sank searching for you. I was moving through the silence without motion, waiting for you. In a room with a window in the corner, I found truth.
This is my favorite song on the album. It's like
Same.
between this and the song Interzone, but yeah, I
Also my fave.
really dig this one. Yeah.
Because it rocks.
Love the guitar stabs here and the tone on the lead. And they get something resembling a guitar solo, which is very cool.
Right.
And kind of comes out of nowhere. And I think the lyrics here are really strong.
I mean, I guess it's where you learn that like playing, punk in halftime equals like post-punk, right? With the excess.
That's all you
sounds and
need.
Stuff like that. That's all it is right there. I also love the guitar textures, even when it drops out in some places, kind of creates that mood for me. And I love the guitar lick, the tone, even when he kind of walks down chromatically is just kind of interesting in its set. In some ways, it doesn't necessarily sound like a lot of the other stuff on the album. A highlight in some ways kind of catches you by surprise.
See, I think it fits enough for me because it's funny you mentioned Interzone. That's the one that Peter Hook sings. That song was so out of left field for the record that it didn't feel like it fit super well.
Fair enough.
Whereas Shadow Play feels a little more like the rest of the record.
I also think that this is the best presentation of Ian Curtis's voice. With the intensity that the song has, he comes off a little David Byrne-esque.
Yeah.
Because it's a contrast. When everything is sort of subdued and pulled back, it can be a little bit of a just depressive mush. But this is a very good highlight of how he can actually be an effective singer and frontman. And if they were playing up-tempo and a little bit faster and a little bit more energetic live, it probably worked a lot better live for some of the songs that they pulled it back a lot more in the studio.
So yeah, this was also my favorite on the album. Again, maybe it's just because it rocked or moved, but the thing that bothered me were the gunshot sounds. The first one goes off at 110. I didn't really think they added anything. Like they weren't deployed strategically to emphasize something. It was just like, just out of nowhere. Instead of maybe emphasizing a musical passage or landing on a note or something, it just felt like they were just like firing off sound effects just to do it.
But Adam, have you been on heroin with 14 synthesizers?
and reverb units.
And plate reverbs. I have not. So you're right. I can't make a judgment call here. All right. We're going to move things on to the last track on our focus list. This one is called I Remember Nothing.
were strangers. We're strangers away too long. Away too long.
So this is the one. I was in pain during this song. There are some just so atrociously bad notes sung in this song that it physically caused a reaction in my body. And again, I don't understand why they didn't try it again. Or maybe they did try it a lot and they're like, yeah, sorry, man, you just can't hit
This is
that
as
note.
good as it's going to get.
But this comes down to something we've talked about, Rob, you and I, in our own musical projects, is writing for your voice.
Yep.
Long held notes are hard.
Yeah.
And long held notes swing out of tune. And if you start it out of tune, ooh, it ain't swinging anywhere good. It's only going to get more painful as the song goes on.
That is something that good vocalists do. And oftentimes it takes years. It takes a lot of practice for people to get good at that. And I'll speak for myself. So this is a very first record kind of mistake to make. But I agree. When you come out of the box with the off-key caterwauling, that makes it really hard to like your try. A lot of the other ones, they started with like a groove and a driving thing, and then he eventually gets to off key, and I'm like, that slightly ruins it, but I'm still vibing. This one, it just kicks right in. It's not great.
I also wonder if this is another case where like the band did not have much control, or even Ian Curtis did a bunch of takes and Hannett's like, yeah, this one, right? I mean, he's that guy who's trying to be super edgy and weird. And I mean, it's the same guy who made Steve Morris like take apart his entire drum kit because he heard one single rattle. And the band's like, we'd honestly never heard anything. Like, he would make it so cold. I mean, this song sounds like Ian Curtis is freezing. Maybe that's the problem. He turned down the AC so much in the studio. It's just his like bones shivering.
I had a note that perhaps when they came back to do vocals, if Hannett detuned the instrument track and had him sing to it, and then when he put everything back together, he used the original tuning or like, up a few sets, because it is so consistently out of key. It's almost like he can't hear the notes, because I know he can hit notes because he does hit them and it's right in his wheelhouse. It's not super high, but it's so consistently off that I was thinking like, well, what if this is part of that thing where Hannett's like, driving him nuts just to be artistic. So
he sounds like a vindictive son of a bitch, this Hannett.
he does. He's a rough guy to work with.
Someone described him as Frankenfurter, the mad scientist type, but if you substitute the cross-dressing for his smack habit, like that's that insane.
Yeah, you better watch out. He might take this, track that you're putting down here and remix you, and make it sound terrible. With a bunch of pew pew pews.
Laser sounds. I didn't say those.
I didn't do that.
All right, now it is time for the most exciting part of the podcast, where we throw it around the studio and get those ever crucial votes on whether you need to hear this album before you die. So I'm going to throw it over to Rob first.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I'm a little on the fence, but I think I'm like at least 65% on yes. I'm going to go yes. It's not an overly challenging yes for me. I definitely enjoyed listening to the record. It did grow on me. It definitely has flaws. Come at me, haters, or us. But I think it still sounds amazingly modern and interesting. I think it influenced a hell of a lot. I took a peek at the other Joy Division record on the list, their only other record, and I have to say I like this better. So when you're this high concept, who has time for execution? Am I right, guys?
Touche.
I wouldn't know. I only write songs about fast food chains.
All right, let's throw it over to Andrew.
I think you probably already know my answer, but from a band like this that influenced The Cure and U2 and Tears for Fears, the bands that I grew up with, and then stuff that I listened to as an adult, like Interpol and TP on the Radio, Block Party. You guys Block Party fans? These guys, Block Party, clearly listen to Adam, I know you have not heard
I have not heard of Block Party.
Adam, The Killers. They influenced The Killers.
Oh, well, now I love them.
For me, based on all the bands that sort of grew out of their influence, and again, what I think Ian Curtis stands for in terms of mental health care. It's overall unapologetic, yes.
I like how you just made it that much harder for you guys to say no with that little mental health tag.
So, Adam, you hate mental health? Yes, I hate. All right. We're going to throw it over to Tom next.
So I will fully admit I don't quite get why this has become what it has become, but because it has become what it has become, it's got to be a yes. I feel like any musical education and appreciation of the lineage of 80s into 90s into modern day music, you kind of have to have a foundation in a band that is this influential. Again, I'm not sure why, but they were. So don't sell your musical education short by not being willing to wade through an album. That is not an easy listen, especially upon the first try, but it's worth it to go through it.
All right, man, that's 3 yeses, so it doesn't really matter what I say. But I will nonetheless give you my opinion. So I hated this week. I listened to this album probably 20 times over the last 7 days. And there's an argument where you can say, Adam, this made you feel something. It made you feel deeply depressed. So it did its job. But I want to outline where I'm coming from. Okay, yes, I'm a vocal snob and his voice is terrible. He can't hit notes. It hurts my teeth. But I thought the songs were boring. Sure, maybe they were a hard right turn from punk, but they weren't breaking new ground in my mind. The production techniques are cool, but they're deployed on base material that I think is super weak, so it doesn't really matter how many effects you add, it's still boring. Also, the band themselves didn't like the album and thought that Hannett had ruined what they wanted. So this album is not even an accurate representation of what the band wanted to do. And I posit that this only became popular because of Ian's tragic demise. I think that if the band had continued and had a couple mediocre albums and had faded away, we would not be talking about them. So therefore, I'm going to vote yes. And here's why.
It's a roller coaster.
I want people to listen to this album in the context of this episode and critically evaluate it and maybe, just maybe, counteract the default stance that this is amazing. So you need to hear this album so that you convince others that they don't need to hear it and that it's overrated. Okay, so there's...
Oh, I see.
Gaming the system. You are a tech guy.
The old
Man.
take it down a peg vote. I like that.
All right, hey, there you have it. So that, I think, is a unanimous vote for Joy Division. Congrats, gents. You're on the list. What a roller coaster it has been. All right, folks, I don't think I need to invite anyone to send us any emails because I'm assuming they're already written and waiting in our inbox right now.
First of all, I already know that the people that write email, you know what? I'm not going to say that.
But I really want you to write and let me specifically know where I got it right or I got it wrong. And you can do that by sending an email to 1001albumcomplaints@gmail.com. And speaking of email, I'm going to throw it over to Rob, who's got his hand in that mailbag.
Yes, thanks so much, Adam. Well, let me dip my hand in. We got a couple good ones this week. This one comes from Joe in Western Mass. He writes, "Hello, complainers. You really have a good thing going. I hope you realize how fortunate you are. The lifelong friendships make for a show like no other. All 6 of you are strong. No weak links. With Rob as commendable scoutmaster."
Nice.
I'm reading it because I like being called a scoutmaster.
Yeah,
right. And
Scoutmaster Rob
it's
is pretty
very accurate.
The conversation is naturally lubricated by your history. The good-natured ribbing and ease with which you disagree and keep it moving forward is a testament to the team spirit. Who the heck doesn't want to meet up weekly with friends you can talk endlessly about music with? Anyway, I'm 20 years older than you, so of course I wince sometimes, but that's half the fun. By the way, I just finished the Weezer episode, and the 20-year gap was particularly palpable. That album landed when you guys were in high school, and that helped give me a handle on your baseline taste. But geez, I had Born to Run, you had Weezer's Blue Album. Life ain't fair, I guess. And last thought to all you fellow loyal listeners, get on Patreon. $5 a month. Come on. It's $1.15 a week.
Damn. All right. The check's in
Thank
the mail
you,
to whoever that
Joe. Yeah, appreciate that. That was unsolicited praise for us, but we always love to hear that. Again, we'll take it all. We'll take hate mail. We'll take praise. I got one more here. This is Jamie writing from Newcastle, which is in England, not the Delaware County where we were all born.
Not Newcastle, Delaware. All right.
Greater Northern Delaware. Wow.
He says, "Morning all. This week while being off work sick, I listened to and really enjoyed the PJ Harvey podcast. However, I was slightly confused and intrigued by you saying that she's a UK darling, in quotes, and that she is somehow massive in the UK. For context, I'm 40, a music snob, and I live in the northeast of England, and can say I've only ever had a passing knowledge of PJ Harvey. So while being off sick, I decided to do an unscientific study to find a PJ Harvey fan in the UK. I sent out a few questions in group chats and got back very similar responses. Again, for context, most folks I know are between 40 and 55. Mix of male and female backgrounds, they all live in the UK, and the responses I got were, I know her name, but I've only heard a couple of tracks, or I don't really know her stuff, and one friend even said, is that a person who plays football?
Nice.
Now, I'm not sure if it's the flu or boredom, but I'm even more intrigued to find a real diehard t-shirt wearing, card carrying, autograph collecting fan of PJ Harvey. There must be one out there. And when I hopefully find them, I can ask them, why do you like this rubbish? Maybe they're all hiding in the southwest of England, or maybe we've just uncovered the greatest myth that PJ Harvey is in fact not a UK darling. Either way, I feel I really need to get back to work now. Thank you, gents, for the brilliant work. Again, we encourage you to send us anything that's on your mind, good, bad, and ugly. Send it our way, 1001albumcomplaints@gmail.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Rob. All right. We still have to get our homework assignment for next week, so we're going to throw it over to Tom, who's got the Albinator in the corner there. I think I see it behind you.
Yeah, it's been wearing sunglasses indoors and smoking lots of cigarettes while it talks about how difficult its life is while I provide all of its daily needs. So I'm going to pull it on over here and see if it wants to spit us out an album.
Hasn't done its laundry in a month.
Yeah, it's been me doing its laundry, of course. So without any further ado, drum roll, please. We will be listening to the album is Grievous Angel, and the artist is Graham Parsons.
All right.
Yeah. Interesting. Another young death. Yes?
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes, indeed. We touched on Graham way back with the Flying Burrito Brothers.
Oh, that's right.
but
Yeah. Okay.
This is, I believe, his posthumous release.
Ooh, okay.
Very cool. Well, I'm super unfamiliar with this, but again, who's surprised with that? So, all right. Thank
This
you.
is my surprised face, Adam.
All right, folks, there you go. You've got your homework assignment for the week. It is Grievous Angel by Graham Parsons, and that is going to do it for us here at 1001 Album Complaints. I'm Adam.
I'm Rob.
I'm Tom.
I'm Andrew. She's lost her bush.
Thank you. That is perfect.